Ladies and gentlemen, hello! Episode number 4 of the R3 podcast. It is a smashing episode. Cool, I sound like a 80s presenter there. Anyway, I hope you are all well and not had to grass up any of your neighbours for breaking the rule of 6. This episode is an exciting one and comes in 2 parts as it coincides with the launch of the R3 standard form COVID-19 CVA proposal. The proposal and accompanying COVID-19 standard conditions for company voluntary arrangements are intended for use by SME companies whose businesses have been affected by COVID-19. They are intended to save time and costs and therefore make CVAs more accessible to the SME market. I must stress the standard form is not a panacea. The introduction of the standard form is not intended to replace the professional advice and judgment of insolvency practitioners and lawyers who may be advising companies, but simply form part of their arsenal of available tools to assist their clients. At best, this should be considered a foundation upon which the appropriate CVA can be based. The creation of the standard form and standard conditions was orchestrated by Stuart Perry and Professor Peter Walton, both members of R3's General Technical Committee. Stuart is the chair of the committee. Part 1 of this episode is with Professor Peter Walton, who discusses the meaning of a voluntary arrangement and why they are a good option for companies, small and large. Professor Walton is a director of the Law Research Centre at the University of Wolverhampton. He has conducted several large research projects on behalf of, respectively, the UK government and the UK insolvency practitioner profession. His research has been cited in Parliament on several occasions and has been the subject of House of Commons early day motions. He is currently acting as consultant to the government of Kenya, whereby he is redrafting Kenya's insolvency regime. Part 2 of this episode is with Stuart, who discusses the proposal in detail and the meaning behind it. Stuart is a partner at Phil Fisher's insolvency and restructuring practice. He primarily acts for insolvency practitioners, various categories of financier, distressed companies and their directors. His experience covers the full range of insolvency work, from purchases and sales in trading insolvencies to multinational, multi-million pound frauds. Like with all podcasts, it is important to stress that whilst care has been taken in the preparation of this podcast, it is intended for general guidance only and does not constitute legal advice. Let's begin. Welcome, Peter, to the R3 podcast. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Ben.
Good. Okay, so this episode really focuses on the meaning of a voluntary arrangement and why they are a good option for companies, small and large. I'm now going to imagine myself as a student at the University of Wolverhampton, sitting in a now virtual lecture room with Professor Peter Walton, about to give a talk on voluntary arrangements. So over to you, Professor.
A company voluntary arrangement, a CVA, is a form of statutory contract whereby the company puts a proposal to its creditors and shareholders, and the proposal itself will take the form either of a composition of debts or a scheme of arrangement, or a mixture of the two. So composition of debts is where the company promises to pay only a proportion of its outstanding debts to its creditors, and a scheme of arrangement is the phrase we usually use to describe an arrangement where delayed payment is being made. So you commonly come across CVAs, which are both a composition and a scheme, in that a company might promise less than full payment, might promise 50p in the pound on what it owes, and may need to delay payment of that. So it's both a composition and a scheme. Some CVAs promise 100% payment to its creditors, in which case that would usually just take the form of a scheme where creditors are paid in full, but that payment is delayed. I think it's important to point out with CVAs that there are various protections in place. So the CVA terms can't interfere with the rights of secured creditors or interfere with the priority of preferential creditors unless they consent to such variations of their interests. Crucially, and I think one of the great strengths of CVAs is they're pushed through, they're passed by the creditors by a majority of 75% in value of the unsecured creditors approving the terms of the CVA. And so if you've got that 75% of unsecured creditors approving it, they can in effect cram down and bind a dissenting minority. There are a number of other protections in place. So if you are a disgruntled minority creditor, you can apply to the court if you believe the CVA is unfairly prejudicial to your interests in some way, or if there's been some procedural irregularity in its being approved.
Great. So CVAs, I think the general opinion is they are a good option. So why are they, and what are the advantages to a CVA?
Well, I think the obvious advantages that always spring to mind are that there's no court involvement unless there's a problem. So you don't have to have a court hearing. The court doesn't get to look at the agreement. The agreement is very much between the company and its creditors. So without any court hearings, CVAs are a lot cheaper than other options, and so you keep the cost down, so they're particularly helpful to SME businesses. Also, because there's no court hearing, they're relatively quick to get up and running, and they will tend to nearly always provide a much better option for creditors than a liquidation or, for instance, a pre-pack administration would, where payments to creditors are usually very small if they exist at all. And I think the other thing, which is something which people sometimes lose track of, is that a CVA is the only debtor in possession process available under the Insolvency Act. So what I mean by that is that the company itself remains in control of the company's business. So the directors remain in control, running the business as they see fit. It doesn't require an insolvency practitioner such as an administrator or liquidator to come in and take over and usurp their position. So all of those things tend to lead to a positive outcome for creditors, a positive outcome from the participators within the company, if a CVA is the right option for a particular company.
Great. So, I mean, when I used to work in practice, I worked on a number of CVAs, and some of them did fail or were terminated early and entered into another insolvency process. Is there a common reason why they fail?
There's a number of reasons why you see CVAs terminating early, and maybe I'll just run through some of those.
Yep.
And so one of the things that a lot of creditors will say is that directors, when they put together their plan for a CVA, they are overly optimistic in terms of their financial forecasting. So they think their cash flow is going to be quite different to how it actually turns out. So sometimes people would blame the directors for being overly optimistic. Sometimes directors are blamed because they don't take the necessary steps to address the reasons for the company's financial distress. So if there are certain underlying problems with the business, if you don't address those underlying problems, entering into a CVA can just mean that you repeat the history of the company and you fail again for similar reasons. So there is some evidence to suggest that quite often directors are overly optimistic. Quite often directors don't take the necessary steps that are needed. So sometimes a change in management is what's required. Sometimes more money coming into the business is what's required. There may be certain aspects of the business that need to be supported and other aspects of the business that need to be de-emphasized. So having a sound business plan going forward that doesn't repeat the errors of the past is quite critical. On the flip side of that, some CVAs don't succeed in terms of running their full course, largely because sometimes the creditors are just too demanding. So it may well be that the debtor company can afford to pay a part of its debt, but if the creditors are demanding 100% of their debt to be paid, quite often that level of debt repayment is just too much for the company to repay. So sometimes creditors are overly demanding in what's required, and part of that sometimes leads to the CVA itself being over prolonged duration. And so if you've got a CVA which is due to run for 2 or 3 years, there's a good chance that the company can carry on going and trading through the restrictions of the CVA during that period of time. But the longer the CVA is signed up for, so a 5-year CVA is quite often just a sort of slow death for the company. It's 5 years is an awfully long time to carry on trading successfully and repaying historic debt. So I think the shorter term 2 or 3 year CVAs are more likely to lead to a more positive result for the creditors. And creditors need to be realistic in terms of how much they're going to be paid back. And so it's a mixture of things, really. The different stakeholders in a CVA situation would point to other people when a CVA doesn't run its course successfully. But those are the sort of common factors where they do tend to terminate.
That's a good point. I mean, because thinking about it, the CVAs I historically been involved with, the 2 to 3 year ones were actually successful, and the 5-year ones were the ones that tend to collapse into another insolvency process. But anyway, back to VAs. So they tend to get some negative media coverage, particularly if a arrangement involves landlords at the moment. Do you think the negative press is justified, or is the negativity generally from one specific type of creditor making a bigger noise?
I think, unfortunately, some parts of the media have not always fully understood how CVAs operate. They're quite often reported as being controversial procedures, whereas, in fact, I don't think they're controversial at all. They're quite the opposite of controversial in that what the company is trying to do is to act in an entirely reasonable and honourable way to pay back as much debt as it can and for the company to survive, to keep employing its employees and to keep paying its taxes. So I don't think they're controversial. I think the media sometimes overstates some of the difficulties that certain creditors have experienced. And I think you're right. When you pick on landlords, certainly landlords have felt in recent times that some CVAs have been drafted in a way which impacts more severely on landlords than other creditors. They've got a point to some extent, but I think what I would emphasise there is that in the cases where they've gone to court and complained of unfair prejudice towards them in terms of the terms of the CVA itself being unfairly prejudicial to their interests, the courts have looked very closely to see whether or not the terms are in fact unfairly prejudicial. And decisions such as the Debenhams case where Mr. Justice Norris went through the Debenhams CVA, his lordship explained very clearly what was meant by fairness in this context. And if you are leasing premises at a contract rate which is significantly above the current market value, then you can see why tenants want to negotiate a reduction in the rent. If that's the only way they're going to survive, then landlords in those situations may be required to take a haircut on their rent. So I don't think in the round that landlords have been treated particularly badly. I can see why they think they have, but I do think that the courts are there as the backstop. And I think the courts have done a good job in ensuring fairness overall.
Thank you. So, as you know, the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act introduced a new restructuring plan. Do you think this will become popular and put VAs to one side, or is the restructuring plan standalone and can work alongside a CVA?
I know a lot of my colleagues in practice would like to think that the new restructuring plan will be very popular across the market. I think because it's so clearly linked to the mechanism of the Companies Act scheme of arrangement, the two have very many parallels in place. I think the precedent of schemes of arrangement, because it tends to be such a complex scheme of arrangement, because you have to have court hearings, you tend to find schemes of arrangement are only used for larger companies. And so far, the evidence would suggest that the new restructuring plan is going to be similarly limited, that it's not really going to appeal to the SME market, just because it's time consuming, there's a lot of court action, and the documentation is likely to be similarly complex and expensive. So although it would be lovely to see the restructuring plan enter the scene and take some of the ground currently occupied by CVAs, I think realistically there won't be many SME restructuring plans. I think the CVA remains the best option for most SMEs.
Interesting, thank you. So before we wrap up, do you have any more thoughts on CVAs and the benefits of them?
I think I would just say that I think CVAs, they're often referred to in a way which suggests that they're the sort of poor relation in terms of the Insolvency Act procedures. And I think that's unfair. And I think CVAs, we've had them since 1986. I think they're very familiar to practitioners. They're inherently very flexible in terms of what you can put into them. And I think, generally speaking, they are the best tool available to many SMEs and indeed larger companies where the company wants to survive intact and to pay back as honourably as it can as much of its debt as it can. And I think it's a better option for creditors than a winding up would normally be, and certainly a pre-pack would normally be, in circumstances where it's appropriate to be used. So not every company can be saved, but if a company can be saved, I think the CVA should be something which is considered more fully, more often by practitioners.
Brilliant. Thank you, Peter, for your time today. It's really appreciated. So part 2 of this episode will be with Stuart Perry, who you worked with on the R3 standard COVID-19 CVA proposal. I do not wish to discuss the proposal now and steal the limelight away from Stuart, but what are your thoughts on the proposal and who is it aimed at?
Yeah, well, we've spent an awful lot of time talking to different people and trying to put together the COVID-specific CVA, and it is intended for SMEs only who have been specifically affected by the pandemic. And I think the wonderful thing about the project is that a huge number of practitioners have given up their time and expertise to feed into the project. And I think what we've come up with is a really useful set of documentation. And I think it's a sign that the insolvency community is trying its best to save as many companies and as many jobs as can be saved during this difficult time, and to produce the precedent documentation in effect in effect puts a lot of practitioners sort of out of work in terms of if it's already largely in place, they're doing themselves out of fees. So I think it is an act of altruism by the profession, and it's something that should be lauded by people.
Thank you, and thank you again for today's. Been really interesting, and the work you and Stuart have done on the proposal has been exceptional. So, thank you for on behalf of the R3 technical team and the members.